Tonight, we are going to journey back over 3,000 years to explore one of ancient Egypt's most mysterious and sacred ceremonies, the Sed Festival, a celebration that promised pharaohs eternal life and the power to rule forever. You will discover how these god-kings proved their strength, renewed their divine energy, and connected with forces beyond our understanding, all through rituals that have fascinated historians for centuries. Before we go back in time together, if you're enjoying settling in for the night with a bit of Egyptian history, consider hitting subscribe. And I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Have you ever wondered what it would take to prove you could rule a kingdom for eternity? In ancient Egypt, pharaohs faced exactly this challenge, and the answer came in the form of a spectacular event called the Sed Festival, known in Egyptian as the Sed. This was not just any celebration. This was a test, a renewal, and a promise, all wrapped into one magnificent ceremony that would determine whether a king was worthy to continue his reign. The Sed Festival was traditionally held after a pharaoh had ruled for 30 years. 30 long years of managing one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth, maintaining order across the land, keeping the gods happy, and ensuring that the Nile flooded at just the right time each year to feed millions of people. 30 years was a lifetime in ancient Egypt, where many people never lived to see their 40th birthday. For a king to reach this milestone meant he had survived wars, disease, political plots, and the countless dangers that came with wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. But here is what makes the Sed Festival truly fascinating. It was not just about celebrating 30 years of rule. The ancient Egyptians believed that a king's power was not unlimited. They thought that royal energy, that divine force that allowed a pharaoh to maintain balance in the universe, could wear out over time, like a battery slowly losing its charge. The pharaoh was seen as a living god, the bridge between the human world and the realm of deities. He was responsible for keeping Ma'at, the cosmic order, in perfect balance. If his power weakened, the entire world could fall into chaos. The Nile might not flood, crops could fail, enemies could invade, the very stars might fall from the sky. So the Sed Festival was created as a solution to this problem. It was a way to magically renew the king's strength, to recharge that divine battery, and to prove to everyone, both human and divine, that the pharaoh was still fit to rule. Think of it as a cosmic reset button, a chance for the king to shed his old, tired self and emerge reborn, as fresh and powerful as the day he first took the throne. The earliest evidence we have for the Sed Festival goes back more than 5,000 years, to the very beginning of Egyptian civilization. Archaeologists have found depictions of what might be Sed Festival ceremonies on artifacts from the reign of King Narmer, the pharaoh who united Upper and Lower Egypt around 3,100 years before the Common Era. One particularly interesting piece is Narmer's ceremonial mace head, which shows the king wearing the special Sed Festival clothing and performing rituals that would become standard for this celebration for millennia to come. But the clearest early evidence comes from the reign of King Den of the First Dynasty, who ruled around 2,900 years before the Common Era. We have actual labels from wine jars found in his tomb that mention the Sed Festival by name. These little pieces of ancient writing, pressed into clay or carved on stone, tell us that Den celebrated this royal jubilee, proving that even in the earliest days of unified Egypt, the pharaohs were already using this ceremony to demonstrate their continued right to rule. The festival got its name from an ancient Egyptian god named Sed, though he was also known as Wepwawet, the opener of the ways. This was a wolf god, fierce and powerful, associated with war and with guiding souls through the dangerous paths of the afterlife. The connection between a wolf god and the king's renewal might seem strange at first, but in Egyptian thinking it made perfect sense. Wolves were strong, enduring creatures that could travel great distances. They were survivors. By connecting the festival to Sed, the pharaohs were calling on that same strength and endurance for themselves. As you lie there listening to this story, imagine yourself standing in the shadow of massive stone walls, watching as preparations begin for one of these ancient festivals. The air is thick with anticipation. Priests are moving through temple corridors, checking and rechecking every detail of the coming ceremony. Artists are painting walls with scenes of previous festivals. Craftsmen are building special thrones and platforms. Musicians are practicing the ancient songs that have been passed down through countless generations. Everyone knows that what is about to happen is not just important for the king. It is important for all of Egypt, for the entire world as they understood it. The festival would typically last for several days, though some celebrations stretched on for weeks. During this time, the pharaoh would perform a series of rituals designed to prove his continued vitality and to magically renew his connection to the divine powers that made his rule legitimate. He would run, he would make offerings, he would be crowned again and again, he would raise sacred pillars, and he would commune with the gods in ways that ordinary mortals could never dream of doing. What did failing this test mean? The ancient texts are not entirely clear, but there are hints in Egyptian mythology and ritual that make scholars wonder about darker possibilities. Some researchers have suggested that in very ancient times, before the pharaohs became as powerful as they later would, a king who could not complete the Sed Festival successfully might have faced a grim fate. There are theories, though they remain controversial, that the Sed Festival might have replaced an even older custom where aging kings were actually killed to make way for younger, stronger rulers. We find echoes of this idea in Egyptian mythology, particularly in the story of Osiris, the god who was murdered by his brother Set and then resurrected to become king of the afterlife. The pharaoh was closely identified with Osiris, and many of the Sed Festival rituals had connections to this myth of death and rebirth. The king would symbolically die during parts of the ceremony and then be reborn, stronger than before. It was a way of getting the benefits of a fresh, new king without actually having to replace the current ruler. By the time we get to the better documented periods of Egyptian history, during the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom, the Sed Festival had become a grand celebration rather than a test that might end in death. But the symbolism of renewal through a kind of death remained central to the ceremony. The king was believed to shed his old, mortal form and take on a renewed, more divine nature. He was not just refreshed, he was transformed. One of the most beautiful aspects of the Sed Festival was its connection to the unification of Egypt. The ceremony was believed to be a reenactment of the very first unification of the two lands, when Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt were joined together under one crown by the legendary King Menes, who might have been the same person as Narmer. During the festival, the pharaoh would perform rituals that demonstrated his control over both parts of the kingdom. He would wear the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. He would sit on thrones representing both lands. He would receive the symbolic submission of representatives from every part of his kingdom. This idea of unification was absolutely central to Egyptian kingship. Egypt was not naturally one country. The Nile Valley in the south, Upper Egypt, was a long, narrow strip of fertile land hemmed in by desert on both sides. The Nile Delta in the north, Lower Egypt, was a wide, marshy region where the river split into many channels before flowing into the Mediterranean Sea. These two regions had different geographies, different cultures, different patron deities, and throughout Egyptian history there was always the danger that they might split apart again. The pharaoh's main job, the thing that justified his absolute power, was keeping these two lands united. The Sed Festival was a way of renewing that unification, of proving that the king still had the strength and the divine favor needed to hold the two lands together. Every ritual, every symbol, every prayer during the festival reinforced this message to gods and humans alike, that the king was the rightful ruler of all Egypt. After the first Sed Festival at 30 years, tradition held that the ceremony should be repeated every 3 years thereafter. However, this was more of a guideline than a strict rule. Some pharaohs celebrated their jubilees more frequently, especially if they had long reigns and wanted to continually reinforce their legitimacy. Others might have gone longer between festivals, perhaps due to financial constraints since these celebrations were extraordinarily expensive, or perhaps because of wars or other disruptions. The record holder for Sed festivals was the great Ramesses II, one of the most famous pharaohs in all of Egyptian history. Ramesses II, also called Ramesses the Great, ruled for an astounding 67 years during the 19th dynasty of the New Kingdom, from around 1279 to 1213 years before the Common Era. He lived into his 90s, an almost unheard of age for that time period, and during his incredibly long reign, Ramesses celebrated either 13 or 14 Sed festivals, depending on which ancient records you trust. Think about that for a moment. 13 or 14 times, this man went through the exhausting rituals of the Sed festival. 13 or 14 times, he ran the ceremonial course. 13 or 14 times, he proved to his people and his gods that he was still fit to rule. And each time, he emerged renewed, ready to continue guiding Egypt through war and peace, prosperity and hardship, building projects and religious reforms. Ramesses II did not just survive. He thrived decade after decade, constantly renewing himself through these ancient rituals of power. Another pharaoh famous for his Sed festivals was Amenhotep III of the 18th dynasty, who ruled during the height of Egypt's wealth and power in the 14th century before the Common Era. Amenhotep III celebrated 3 Sed festivals in his 30th, 34th, and 37th years of rule. For his festivals, he built an entire new palace complex at a place called Malkata on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes. This was not just any palace. It was a massive complex covering acres and acres of land, decorated with brilliant blue tiles that caught the sunlight and made the whole place seem like something from a dream. Amenhotep III even had workers dig a huge artificial lake next to his palace, which he had filled with water for celebrations associated with his Sed festivals. Ancient records tell us that he had a royal barge built, covered in gold and precious stones, which he sailed across this lake as part of the ceremonies. Imagine the sight, this golden ship gliding across blue water, carrying a god-king dressed in festival regalia, with all the nobility of Egypt watching from the shores. It must have seemed like something out of the realm of the gods brought down to earth. The expense and effort that went into these festivals tells us something important about ancient Egyptian values. These were not frivolous celebrations. They were not the ancient equivalent of birthday parties. The Sed festival was a state necessity, a ritual that maintained the cosmic order and ensured the continued prosperity of the entire nation. No cost was too great, no effort too much, because the alternative, a weakened pharaoh unable to maintain Ma'at, was simply unthinkable. The Sed festival also represented a fascinating interaction between tradition and innovation. While the core rituals remained remarkably consistent over thousands of years, each pharaoh brought their own interpretation and emphasis to the celebration. Some focused heavily on the military aspects, demonstrating their continued ability to defend Egypt. Others emphasized religious devotion, showing their close relationship with the gods. Still, others used the festival as an opportunity for massive building projects that would employ thousands of workers and leave permanent monuments to their reign. Some pharaohs took creative liberties with the timing of their Sed festivals. The heretical pharaoh Akhenaten, who attempted to revolutionize Egyptian religion by promoting the sun disk Aten as the supreme deity, celebrated his first Sed Festival in only his third year of rule. This was highly unconventional and caused considerable controversy among the traditional priesthood. Akhenaten was making a statement that his reign was so divinely favoured, so revolutionary, that the old rules did not apply to him. Whether his subjects agreed with this interpretation is another matter, and, indeed, after his death, Egypt quickly returned to the traditional religious practices he had tried to suppress. Another unusual case was that of Queen Hatshepsut, one of the few women to rule as pharaoh rather than as queen consort. Hatshepsut claimed she celebrated a Sed Festival, though scholars debate whether she actually did so, or whether the depictions of Sed Festival imagery in her temples were aspirational or symbolic. If she did celebrate the festival, she would have faced unique challenges as a female pharaoh performing rituals designed for male kings. The evidence suggests she may have counted her years from when she was the wife of Thutmose II, thus reaching the 30-year requirement by including her time as queen consort before she became pharaoh herself. This demonstrates the flexibility that even a tradition as ancient and sacred as the Sed Festival could accommodate when necessary. As we prepare to move deeper into our exploration of the Sed Festival, let your mind drift back through the centuries. Picture the Nile flowing endlessly, as it has for millennia. Picture the sun rising over the eastern desert, just as it did when these ancient kings walked the earth. Picture the stone temples and palaces, many of which still stand today, silent witnesses to ceremonies that once filled them with music, incense, and the prayers of thousands. The Sed Festival was a bridge between past and future, a moment when time seemed to fold back on itself, allowing the pharaoh to become young again while still carrying all the wisdom of his years. It was magic made manifest, and understanding it helps us understand how the ancient Egyptians saw their world, their kings, and the delicate balance that kept their civilization running smoothly for 3,000 years. Chapter 2. The Sacred Architecture of Renewal. Where does a god prove his divinity? The ancient Egyptians had a very specific answer to this question. They built special spaces, architectural marvels designed precisely for the Sed Festival. And nowhere is this more evident than in the magnificent complex of King Djoser at Saqqara, which stands to this day as one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. Djoser ruled during the Third Dynasty of the Old Kingdom, around 2,680 years before the Common Era. His reign marked a turning point in Egyptian architecture because his advisor, a brilliant man named Imhotep, who would later be worshipped as a god himself, designed something that had never been done before, a pyramid. But not just any pyramid. Djoser's Step Pyramid was the very first large-scale stone building in the world, and surrounding it was an enormous complex that included a complete Sed Festival court built in eternal stone. Before Imhotep's revolutionary work for Djoser, Egyptian buildings had been made primarily of mud brick, even royal structures. Mud brick was practical, relatively easy to make, and worked well in Egypt's dry climate. But it was not permanent. Mud brick buildings crumbled over time, washed away in rare rainstorms, or simply wore down with age. Stone had been used for small things, for statues and offering tables, but nobody had attempted to build an entire complex in stone until Imhotep convinced Djoser to do exactly that. The reason for this bold choice was directly connected to the Sed Festival. The festival was about eternal renewal, about making the king's power last forever. What better way to embody that concept than to build the festival court in a material that would last forever? Stone was eternal. Stone would stand when everything else had turned to dust. By constructing his Sed Festival court in stone, Djoser was making a statement that echoed through the ages. His power, his legitimacy, his divine right to rule would never end, not even after death. Let us walk through Djoser's complex together in your imagination. You approach from the east, and ahead of you rises a massive wall of white limestone, 10.5 meters high, stretching around an area of more than 37 acres. This wall is not plain. It is decorated with recessed panels that create a pattern resembling the facade of a palace. The Egyptians called this type of decoration a serek, and it was a symbol of royal authority. The entire complex is enclosed by this wall, creating a sacred space separated from the ordinary world outside. You find the entrance, a narrow doorway that leads into a long corridor lined with columns. But these are not columns like you might imagine. These are engaged columns, actually attached to the walls on either side, carved to look like they are supporting the roof but not actually freestanding. Why would the architects do this? Because they were still learning what stone could do. They were not sure yet if freestanding stone columns would hold up under the weight of a stone roof, so they played it safe by attaching them to walls. But the decorative effect is magnificent. The columns are carved to look like bundles of reeds or palm ribs tied together, a design that echoes the organic materials that had been used in earlier, non-permanent buildings. These column designs tell us something fascinating about how the Egyptians thought about architecture. They were not simply creating functional buildings, they were translating an entire architectural language from temporary materials into permanent ones. The reed bundles that formed columns in mud brick buildings were carefully recreated in stone, preserving not just the function but the visual vocabulary of earlier architecture. This was important because these forms carried meaning. A reed bundle column did not just hold up a roof, it symbolized the primordial marsh from which, according to Egyptian creation myths, the world first emerged. By carving these organic forms in stone, Imhotep was connecting Djoser's eternal complex to the very creation of the universe. As you move through this entrance corridor, you are being prepared, psychologically and spiritually, for what lies ahead. The passage is long and relatively dim, a transition space between the outside world and the sacred precinct. When you finally emerge on the other side, you find yourself in a vast open courtyard, and dominating everything is the step pyramid itself, rising in 6 massive tiers to a height of 60 meters. But today we are not focused on the pyramid. We are interested in the Sed Festival court, which lies to the southeast of the pyramid. This is where the magic happened, where Djoser and other pharaohs would have performed the renewal rituals that kept their power fresh and their connection to the gods strong. The Sed Festival court at Djoser's complex is one of the most fascinating archaeological features in all of Egypt because it shows us exactly what a Sed Festival setting looked like. The court is a long rectangular space, and on either side of it stand rows of what look like buildings. These structures have doorways, facades, and architectural details that suggest functional buildings. But here is the amazing thing. They are not functional at all. They are dummy buildings, solid masses of stone with false doors and decorative facades but no actual interior rooms. Why would anyone build fake buildings? The answer lies in Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife and the nature of ritual space. These dummy structures represented the actual buildings that would have been used during a real Sed festival celebrated by a living king. In life, the festival would have taken place in actual buildings where priests could prepare offerings, where the king could rest between rituals, where representatives of different regions of Egypt could gather. But in death, the king did not need functional space. He needed symbolic space. His spirit, his ka, would celebrate Sed festivals eternally in the afterlife, and for that, representations were enough. The dummy buildings served another purpose as well. They were a kind of permanent stage set, frozen in stone, that captured the essential form and meaning of the Sed festival without needing all the practical details. They showed the pattern, the layout, the sacred geography of the celebration. Anyone who entered this court, even 3,000 years after Djoser's death, could look around and understand immediately that this was where a king proved his eternal fitness to rule. In the center of the Sed Festival court at Saqqara, Archaeologists have found two stone markers called boundary stones. These are incredibly significant objects because they relate to one of the central rituals of the Sed Festival, the ceremonial run. We will explore this ritual in more detail in the next chapter, but for now, understand that these boundary stones marked the course that the pharaoh had to run to demonstrate his physical vitality. They defined sacred space, creating an area that represented all of Egypt in miniature. By running between these stones, the pharaoh was symbolically traversing his entire kingdom, claiming and reclaiming every inch of land under his rule. The architecture of Djos's Sed Festival court also includes special structures called the House of the North and the House of the South. These buildings, which unlike most of the dummy structures did have interior rooms, represented Upper and Lower Egypt. The House of the South symbolized Upper Egypt with its traditional architecture, while the House of the North represented Lower Egypt. During the festival, the king would perform rituals at each of these buildings, receiving the symbolic submission and loyalty of both parts of his kingdom. The details of these structures are remarkably sophisticated. The House of the South, for example, features columns with capitals carved to resemble the papyrus plant, which grew abundantly in Lower Egypt. Wait, that seems backwards, doesn't it? Why would the House of the South feature symbols of Lower Egypt? This apparent contradiction actually reveals deep Egyptian thinking about complementary opposites and the unification of the two lands. Each house incorporated symbols of both regions, demonstrating that they were not separate entities, but parts of a unified whole under the pharaoh's rule. One of the most interesting architectural features associated with Sed festivals is found not at Saqqara, but at temples throughout Egypt. Many pharaohs carved reliefs on temple walls showing themselves performing Sed festival rituals. These carved scenes served multiple purposes. They recorded historical events, showing future generations that a particular king had celebrated the jubilee. They also had a magical function, allowing the king to celebrate eternal Sed festivals in the spirit world after death. And they served as propaganda, reminding anyone who visited the temple that this pharaoh had achieved the 30-year milestone and received divine approval to continue ruling. Some of the most beautiful Sed festival reliefs come from the temple complex of Amenhotep III at Malkata, which we mentioned earlier. These reliefs show the king performing various festival rituals, and they give us invaluable details about what actually happened during these celebrations. We see the king running, the king receiving crowns, the king making offerings, the king sitting on special thrones. Each image is like a window into the past, showing us moments from ceremonies that took place more than 3,300 years ago. The preservation of these reliefs is itself something of a miracle. Many of them were carved in raised relief, where the background stone was cut away, leaving the images standing proud of the surface. This technique made the carvings very vulnerable to damage. Over the centuries, wind-blown sand, occasional rain, vandalism by later peoples who did not understand or respect the ancient images, and simple erosion have destroyed countless Egyptian reliefs. That so many Sed festival scenes have survived tells us something about how they were protected, often by being located in interior rooms of temples where the elements could not reach them. The Sun Temple of the 5th dynasty pharaoh Nusera, who ruled around 2,400 years before the Common Era, contains the most complete pictorial record of a Sed festival from the Old Kingdom. The reliefs at this temple show an elaborate sequence of rituals spanning what must have been many days. Scholars have spent decades studying these images, trying to understand the exact order of events, the meaning of each action, the symbolism behind every gesture and costume change. What these architectural remains and artistic depictions tell us is that the Sed festival was not improvised. It was a carefully choreographed ceremony with every movement, every word, every ritual action specified by tradition stretching back to the very beginning of Egyptian civilization. The festival courts and temple reliefs were instruction manuals carved in stone, ensuring that the proper procedures would never be forgotten, that future kings would always know exactly how to perform the rituals that would renew their power. Consider the effort that went into creating these spaces. Thousands of workers quarrying limestone, transporting massive blocks, shaping and carving and polishing stone. Skilled craftsmen painting intricate scenes with pigments made from ground minerals. Priests consulting ancient texts to make sure every detail was correct. All of this for a ceremony that most of the population would never even witness directly. The Sed Festival was primarily a ritual performed by and for the king, with priests and high officials as witnesses and participants, but the common people generally experienced it only indirectly, through proclamations and perhaps through being given extra rations or time off work during the festival period. Yet the Egyptians poured enormous resources into these festival spaces because they understood something profound about the relationship between architecture and belief. Buildings shape how we think and feel. A grand, beautiful, awe-inspiring space makes the rituals performed within it seem more important, more powerful, more real. By creating magnificent Sed Festival courts, the pharaohs were not just providing a stage for ceremonies. They were creating an environment where magic could happen, where the boundaries between the human and divine worlds became thin enough for a mortal king to step across and touch eternity. The architectural evolution of Sed Festival spaces also tells us about changing Egyptian ideas about kingship and the afterlife. In Djoser's time, the emphasis was on creating a complete, self-contained, eternal realm for the dead king. The entire pyramid complex, with its festival court, temples, offering chapels, and ceremonial spaces, was designed as a fully functional palace for the afterlife. Later pharaohs simplified this approach, sometimes depicting Sed Festival rituals on temple walls rather than building complete physical courts. But the essential idea remained the same. The king needed to be able to celebrate his jubilee forever, and the architecture had to facilitate that eternal celebration. There is something deeply moving about standing in these ancient spaces today. Djoser's step pyramid complex at Saqqara is open to visitors, and if you are fortunate enough to go there, you can walk through the same entrance corridor that priests and officials walked through more than 4,500 years ago. You can stand in the Sed Festival court and look at the same dummy buildings that served as backdrop for ancient renewal rituals. The paint has faded, the detailed decorations have worn away, but the essential forms remain, testimony to the incredible vision of Imhotep and the determination of Djoser to create something that would last forever. Modern archaeologists and architects continue to study these ancient spaces, using new technologies to understand how they were built and what they meant. Laser scanning has revealed details about the construction process that would be invisible to the naked eye. Computer modeling allows researchers to virtually reconstruct how these spaces would have looked when they were new, with all their paint and decoration intact. These technologies help us appreciate the incredible skill and sophistication of ancient Egyptian architects and builders. And here is the remarkable thing. It worked. Djoser achieved his goal. Through the stone architecture of his pyramid complex, through his eternal Sed Festival court, he really did create something that transcends death. Thousands of years after his physical body turned to dust, people from all over the world come to Saqqara to marvel at what he built. His name is remembered. His power, in a sense, continues. The Sed Festival promised eternal renewal, and through architecture, that promise was fulfilled in a way that even the ancient Egyptians might not have fully anticipated. As you drift deeper into relaxation, imagine yourself in that Sed Festival court at twilight. The harsh Egyptian sun has set, and the stone walls that blazed white in the daylight now glow soft gold in the dying light. Shadows lengthen across the courtyard. A few priests move quietly through the space, lighting lamps in preparation for evening rituals. The air is still warm, but a slight breeze has picked up, carrying with it the scent of the Nile and the distant sound of palms rustling. You stand in the center of the court, between the boundary stones, and you can almost see the ghostly figure of the pharaoh beginning his ceremonial run, his white linen kilt bright against the darkening sky, his movements strong and sure despite his age, proving once again that he is fit to rule, fit to maintain the balance of Ma'at, fit to serve as the bridge between heaven and earth. The stones beneath your feet have absorbed the heat of the day and now radiate warmth upward. You can feel the millennia pressing down, the weight of all those ceremonies, all those pharaohs, all those prayers and offerings and rituals. This place is saturated with meaning, with intention, with the accumulated spiritual energy of thousands of years of human devotion and divine aspiration. And even though the rituals are no longer performed, even though the priests and pharaohs are long gone, something of that energy remains, embedded in the very stones, waiting patiently for those who know how to listen. Chapter 3. The Sacred Run That Proved Everything. At the heart of the Sed Festival was a ritual so simple in concept, yet so profound in meaning that it has captured the imagination of Egyptologists for generations. The ceremonial run. Picture this. A pharaoh, a man who is treated as a living god, who spends his days sitting on thrones, giving commands that affect millions of lives, who is carried on a litter wherever he goes so that his royal feet need not touch common ground. This man would dress in special festival clothing, step into a courtyard before witnesses both human and divine, and run, just run. But what a run it was! This was not a casual jog around a track. This was a ritual race that symbolically encompassed the entire kingdom of Egypt. The pharaoh would run between boundary markers that represented the limits of the known world, claiming and reclaiming every bit of territory under his rule. With each step, he was renewing his contract with the gods. With each breath, he was proving that life and strength still flowed through his veins. With each completion of the course, he was demonstrating that he had the energy and vitality to continue ruling for years to come. Why was running chosen as the central test of the Sed Festival? The answer lies in ancient Egyptian ideas about life force and physical vitality. The Egyptians believed that a person's ka, their life force or spiritual double, was directly connected to their physical body. A strong body meant a strong ka. A weak body indicated a weakening ka, and since the pharaoh's ka was what allowed him to communicate with the gods and channel divine power into the world, any weakness in his physical form was a serious problem. Running was the ultimate test of physical fitness. It required strength in the legs, stamina in the lungs, a healthy heart, good balance, and mental focus. A man who could run was a man in his prime, regardless of his age. The ceremonial run at the Sed Festival was therefore a very public demonstration that the pharaoh still possessed all the physical and spiritual vigour necessary to be an effective king. The course itself was carefully laid out with boundary markers, those sacred stones we mentioned when discussing the architecture of Djoser's complex. The exact length and shape of the course varied somewhat from one festival to another, but the basic idea was consistent. The pharaoh would start at one end, run to a boundary marker, turn, and run back, sometimes repeating this circuit multiple times. In some versions of the ritual, the king would run while carrying special objects. One text describes the pharaoh carrying what is called an oar or a paddle, though this object was probably more symbolic than practical. It might have represented the navigation of the boat of the sun god Ra across the sky, linking the king's physical journey around the festival court to the eternal cosmic journey of the sun. By carrying this symbolic oar, the pharaoh was declaring that just as the sun completes its circuit every day without fail, so too would he continue to complete his royal duties year after year. Other depictions show the king running while wearing or carrying objects associated with kingship. Different types of crowns, ceremonial weapons, or ritual implements. Each of these items added layers of meaning to the run. The crowns reinforced his sovereignty over Upper and Lower Egypt. The weapons symbolized his role as defender of the realm. The ritual implements connected him to the gods and to the sacred traditions that had been passed down through countless generations of pharaohs. One particularly interesting detail about the ceremonial run is that the pharaoh would often be wearing a special festival garment quite different from his usual royal regalia. This was a short, tight-fitting kilt made of the finest white linen that left his legs completely free for running. The linen used for royal garments was extraordinarily fine, sometimes with thread counts that would not be matched until modern industrial weaving. The whiteness of the linen was symbolic, representing purity, divinity, and rebirth. Before important rituals, linen garments would be washed 7 times to ensure they were ritually pure. Over this kilt, the pharaoh sometimes wore a strange, tightly wrapped cloak that covered his upper body and arms, leaving only his head and legs exposed. This outfit, called the Sed Festival cloak, made the king look almost mummy-like, which was probably intentional. It symbolized death and rebirth, the idea that the king was shedding his old form like a snake sheds its skin, emerging renewed and refreshed. The restriction of the arms also made the run more challenging, demonstrating that the pharaoh could succeed even under difficult conditions. Imagine how the pharaoh must have felt as he prepared for this run. He is perhaps 55 years old, maybe older. He has ruled for 30 years through wars, famines, floods, diplomatic crises, family dramas, religious controversies, and all the countless challenges that come with governing a nation. His body bears the marks of time. Perhaps his joints ache in the morning. Perhaps he has wounds from old battles that never quite healed properly. Perhaps his breath comes a bit shorter than it once did. And now he must run. Not privately, in the comfort of his palace, where only trusted servants might see if he stumbles. No, he must run in front of the high priests, the nobility, the military commanders, the representatives of every province of Egypt, and most importantly, in front of the statues of the gods themselves, whose painted eyes seemed to watch his every movement. The pressure must have been immense. This was not just a physical test. It was a moment when the entire foundation of his kingship was on display, when any sign of weakness could undermine the divine authority that held Egypt together. How did pharaohs prepare for this challenge? We have no direct ancient Egyptian training manuals for the Sed Festival run, unfortunately, but we can make some educated guesses based on what we know about Egyptian royal life and about how other cultures have prepared for similar ritual challenges. It seems likely that pharaohs who were approaching their 30th year of rule would have been given special attention by court physicians. Their diets might have been adjusted to keep them in the best possible physical condition. They might have been given particular exercises to maintain their strength and stamina, perhaps disguised as hunting trips or military reviews to preserve the royal dignity. Egyptian medicine was quite sophisticated for its time. Physicians understood the importance of diet, exercise, and hygiene for maintaining health. They had treatments for various ailments, though of course their understanding of human physiology was limited by the technology available to them. Royal physicians would have had access to the best medicines and treatments Egypt could provide, including imported ingredients from distant lands. A pharaoh preparing for his Sed Festival would have received the best possible care to ensure he could perform the run successfully. Some pharaohs took the challenge so seriously that they chose to celebrate their Sed Festivals early, before they were truly old and frail. We have records of kings celebrating their jubilee in their 20th or even 15th year of rule, rather than waiting for the traditional 30 years. Was this because they were worried they might not survive to 30? Or did they simply want to celebrate their triumph while they were still young enough to perform the rituals impressively? The ancient texts do not tell us their reasoning, but the pattern is clear. Some pharaohs chose not to wait. Akhenaten's decision to celebrate his first Sed Festival in only his 3rd year of rule was particularly unusual and controversial. This was not a case of an aging king wanting to celebrate while still physically capable. Akhenaten was young and vigorous. His early Sed Festival was a political and religious statement, part of his broader attempt to revolutionize Egyptian religion and society. By celebrating the festival out of its normal cycle, he was asserting that traditional rules did not constrain him, that his relationship with the divine was so special that he could rewrite even the most sacred traditions. On the other hand, some pharaohs demonstrated truly remarkable physical prowess even at advanced ages. Remember Ramesses II, who celebrated 13 or 14 Sed festivals, meaning he was running these ceremonial courses well into his 80s. Even accounting for the possibility that the pharaoh's run became more symbolic and less athletic as he aged, this is an astonishing achievement. It speaks to exceptional genetics, excellent healthcare by the standards of the time, and probably an iron will that refused to show weakness even as his body inevitably declined. The run was not the only physical challenge of the Sed Festival, though it was the most important. After completing the ceremonial course, the pharaoh would perform other rituals that also required physical ability. He would climb stairs to reach special platforms. He would lower himself onto thrones and rise again. He would lift ritual objects, sometimes quite heavy ones, and hold them aloft for extended periods, while priests chanted prayers and made offerings. All of these actions were tests, public demonstrations that the king still had the strength to perform the duties of his office. There is something very human about this aspect of the Sed Festival that makes it resonate across the millennia. We all face the reality of aging. We all know what it is like to find that our bodies cannot do things as easily as they once could. We all understand the anxiety of having to perform in public when we are not sure we are up to the challenge. The pharaohs, despite their godlike status, despite their enormous power and wealth, faced these same human concerns. The difference was that for them, the stakes were infinitely higher. An ordinary person who cannot run as fast as they once could is simply getting older. A pharaoh who cannot complete the ceremonial run is calling into question the cosmic order itself. This is what made the Sed Festival such a brilliant piece of religious and political theatre. By creating a public test that the pharaoh had to pass, Egyptian tradition acknowledged the reality of aging, while providing a mechanism for the king to prove he was still capable despite his years. It was honest about the challenge while offering a path forward. And by making the test a ritual rather than purely practical requirement, it allowed for a certain amount of interpretation and adaptation. An elderly pharaoh might not run as fast as a young man, but if he completed the course with dignity and performed the rituals correctly, that was enough. The gods would be satisfied. The cosmic order would be maintained. Egypt would continue to prosper. The ceremonial run also had a deeper symbolic meaning connected to the unification of Egypt. By running between boundaries that represented the extents of his kingdom, the pharaoh was ritually traversing his land, visiting every corner of his realm in a compressed, symbolic manner. He was renewing his connection to every part of Egypt, from the cataracts in the south to the Mediterranean in the north, from the eastern desert to the western desert. In Egyptian magical thinking, performing an action symbolically could make it real in the spiritual realm. The pharaoh's run, therefore, was not just a representation of visiting his kingdom. In a very real sense, on a spiritual level, he was visiting every part of Egypt, receiving the loyalty of the local gods, blessing the land, and reinforcing the bonds that held the two lands together. Some versions of the Sed Festival run included the king running the course 4 times, once for each cardinal direction. This connected the ritual to the idea of the king as ruler, not just of Egypt, but of the entire cosmos. Just as the sun god Ra traversed the sky from east to west, just as the stars wheeled overhead following their eternal paths, the pharaoh's circuit around the festival court echoed these cosmic movements. He was aligning himself with the fundamental structures of the universe, proving that his rule was in harmony with the way the gods had designed the world to function. The four directions held deep significance in Egyptian thought. Each direction was associated with specific gods, specific colours, specific symbolic meanings. The east was the direction of birth and renewal, where the sun rose each morning. The west was the direction of death and the afterlife, where the sun set each evening. The north was associated with cool winds and foreign lands beyond Egypt's borders. The south was the direction of the Nile's source, the origin of the life-giving water that made Egypt possible. By running toward each of these directions, the pharaoh was acknowledging and incorporating all these cosmic forces into his renewed kingship. The boundary stones themselves were often inscribed with prayers and declarations. Though few of these ancient markers have survived intact, those that have provide fascinating glimpses into the Egyptian mindset during these ceremonies. One boundary stone might have an inscription that says something like, "The king of Upper and Lower Egypt has run his course and claimed his territory, satisfying the gods and proving his strength before all the divine ones." Another might include prayers, asking the gods to grant the pharaoh millions of years of rule, to keep his limbs strong, to make his heart brave, to ensure that his reign continues as long as the sun shines in the sky. After successfully completing the ceremonial run, the pharaoh would typically be led to a special platform or throne, where he would sit while priests and officials approached to offer congratulations and renewed pledges of loyalty. This moment must have brought profound relief, especially for older pharaohs. He had passed the test. He had proven his fitness. His reign was secure for another cycle. The weight of expectation and anxiety would lift, replaced by the satisfaction of having successfully completed one of the most important rituals in Egyptian kingship. The moment when the pharaoh completed his run must have been electric. The watching crowd would erupt in cheers and prayers. Musicians would begin playing triumphant music. Priests would chant hymns of praise. The gods' statues would be ceremonially acknowledged, as if they too were celebrating the king's success. It was a moment of collective relief and joy, a confirmation that order would continue, that Maat was maintained, that Egypt was safe for another cycle of years. As you continue to relax, imagine the sound of the pharaoh's footsteps echoing across the stone courtyard. The rhythm is steady, strong, purposeful. Each impact of foot against stone is like a heartbeat, the heartbeat of Egypt itself. The watching crowd holds its collective breath. Priests sway slightly as they chant prayers under their breath. The statues of the gods seem to lean forward, their stone eyes watching intently. And the king runs on, completing his circuit, claiming his kingdom once again, renewing the ancient compact between the divine and mortal worlds, ensuring that for at least another cycle, Ma'at will be maintained, the Nile will flood at its appointed time, and Egypt will continue to flourish under his divine rule. The pharaoh's breath comes measured and controlled. He has trained for this moment, prepared his body and spirit. His feet, usually shod in the finest sandals or carried aloft on a litter, now touch the sacred stones directly, and through this contact he draws strength from the land itself. Egypt supports him. The gods watch him. His ancestors' spirits surround him. He is not alone in this run. He carries with him the accumulated power of every pharaoh who came before, every ritual perfectly performed, every prayer correctly spoken, every offering properly made. He is a single man, yes, but in this moment he is also the embodiment of 3,000 years of tradition, the living connection between the first king who united Egypt and the eternal reign that will continue as long as the Nile flows and the sun crosses the sky. Chapter 4. The Crowns, the Thrones, and the Double Kingdom. If running was the physical heart of the Sed Festival, then the crowning ceremonies were its spiritual and political soul. Again and again throughout the multi-day celebration, the pharaoh would be crowned, his divine right to rule reaffirmed through ancient rituals that dated back to the very beginning of Egyptian civilization. These were not simple ceremonies. They were elaborate, multi-layered symbolic dramas that reinforced every aspect of the king's complex identity. The Pharaoh of Egypt wore many crowns, and during the Sed Festival, he would don different ones at different times, each representing a different aspect of his power. The most important were the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt, the southern part of the kingdom running up the Nile Valley, was represented by a white crown called the Djed. This was a tall white crown shaped like a bowling pin, rising to a bulbous top. Lower Egypt, the northern delta region where the Nile splits into many channels before entering the Mediterranean, was represented by a red crown called the Deshret. This was a more complex shape, with a flat top, a raised back section, and a curling wire or stem projecting from the front. When worn together, these two crowns formed the pshent, also called the double crown, the ultimate symbol of unified Egypt. The red crown would fit inside the white crown, creating a spectacular visual representation of the two lands joined under one ruler. During Sed Festival ceremonies, the pharaoh would sometimes wear each crown separately, performing rituals as king of Upper Egypt, and then changing crowns to perform rituals as king of Lower Egypt. At other times, he would wear the double crown, emphasizing the unity he had achieved and maintained. The physical weight of these crowns was considerable. They were not lightweight ceremonial items. They were substantial objects made of various materials, including metal, linen, stiffened with plaster, and leather, often decorated with precious stones and gold. Wearing them for extended periods required neck strength and stamina. The fact that the pharaoh could wear these heavy crowns throughout the long ceremonies of the Sed Festival was itself a demonstration of his physical fitness and royal strength. The act of putting on these crowns was not simple. Each crowning involved prayers, offerings, purification rituals, and the invocation of various gods. The goddess Djed, depicted as a cobra, was the protective goddess of Lower Egypt and was associated with the red crown. The goddess Nekhbet, shown as a vulture, was the protective goddess of Upper Egypt and was linked to the white crown. When the pharaoh put on each crown, he was not just putting on a piece of ceremonial headgear. He was calling upon these goddesses to recognize him, to bless him, to lend him their protective power. He was entering into a relationship with divine forces that would support and sustain his rule. The cobra and the vulture were not just symbols. The Egyptians believed these goddesses could actually manifest in the forms of these creatures. The uraeus, the rearing cobra that adorned the front of many Egyptian crowns, was understood to be a living manifestation of Djed's power. It would magically defend the pharaoh by spitting fire at his enemies. The vulture of Nekhbet, often depicted with wings spread protectively over the king's head, would shield him from harm. These were not metaphors. In Egyptian belief, these were real protective forces that the crowning ceremony activated and directed. Ancient Egyptian texts describe the crown as having its own power, its own divine essence. The crown was not just a symbol of kingship. In some sense, it was kingship. It carried within it the accumulated authority of every pharaoh who had worn it before. When a new king or a king celebrating his Sed Festival put on the crown, he was connecting himself to an unbroken chain of rulers, stretching back to Horus, the first divine king, who had defeated his uncle Set and claimed the throne of Egypt at the beginning of time. The Sed Festival typically included a moment when the pharaoh would sit on special thrones, sometimes described as double thrones or back-to-back thrones, representing Upper and Lower Egypt. These thrones were positioned so that the king could sit first facing one direction, receiving the homage of representatives from Upper Egypt, and then turn and sit facing the other direction, receiving homage from representatives of Lower Egypt. By doing this, he was physically enacting his role as ruler of both lands, giving equal attention and recognition to each part of his kingdom. The thrones themselves were works of art, crafted from expensive materials and decorated with symbols of royal power. They might be made of cedar wood, imported from Lebanon, inlaid with ivory from Africa, decorated with gold from Nubia, and studded with lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. The international reach of these materials was itself a statement about Egypt's power and wealth, demonstrating that the pharaoh commanded resources from across the known world. The imagery of duality runs throughout the Sed Festival like a constant refrain. 2 crowns, 2 thrones, 2 lands, upper and lower, south and north, the sedge plant and the bee, Nekbet and Wadjet, white and red. This was not just about Egypt's geography. It reflected a deeper Egyptian belief in balance and complementary opposites. The Egyptians saw the world as organized in pairs: life and death, order and chaos, light and dark, male and female. These pairs were not in conflict but in creative tension, each necessary for the other to exist. The pharaoh, by ruling over both Upper and Lower Egypt, by wearing both crowns, by sitting on both thrones, was embodying this principle of cosmic balance at the highest level. During the crowning ceremonies, the pharaoh would also carry various royal symbols. The most important of these were the crook and the flail, 2 objects that became so closely associated with pharaonic power that they appear in nearly every official image of Egyptian kings. The crook was a staff with a hooked end, similar to a shepherd's crook. The flail was a handle with 3 strands of beads or chains hanging from it. These objects had practical origins, probably from the very early history of Egyptian kingship, when rulers actually did oversee agricultural work, but by the time of the great Sed festivals, they had become purely symbolic. The crook represented the king's role as shepherd of his people. Just as a shepherd guides and protects his flock, leading them to good pasture and keeping them safe from dangers, so too did the pharaoh guide and protect the people of Egypt. This was not just a nice metaphor. The pharaoh was responsible for the welfare of every person in Egypt, from the highest noble to the lowliest peasant. He was expected to ensure that the Nile flooded properly, that crops grew abundantly, that trade routes remained open, that enemies were kept at bay. He was the shepherd who made sure all his sheep were fed, safe, and thriving. The flail is more mysterious. Some scholars think it represented a whip used in grain harvesting, linking the king to agricultural abundance. Others suggest it might have been a tool for herding goats. Still others believe it had astronomical significance, representing a constellation or the movement of the stars. Whatever its original meaning, by the time of the New Kingdom, the flail had become a fixed part of royal iconography, a symbol of the pharaoh's authority that was never fully explained because everyone simply understood what it meant through cultural tradition. When the pharaoh held the crook in one hand and the flail in the other, crossing them over his chest in the classic royal pose, he was declaring his complete authority over every aspect of Egyptian life. He was shepherd and disciplinarian, nurturer and warrior, provider of abundance and maintainer of order. The X shape, created by the crossed crook and flail, also had symbolic significance, suggesting the 4 cardinal directions and thus the king's authority over all space, or possibly representing the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt through the intersection of 2 lines into a balanced whole. The rituals of crowning and enthronement during the Sed Festival were overseen by high-ranking priests who specialized in these ceremonies. These priests had to know every word of every prayer, every step of every ritual, every symbolic meaning of every gesture. They had trained for years, perhaps decades, learning the traditions that had been passed down through countless generations. A mistake during a Sed Festival crowning could be seen as a terrible omen, suggesting that the gods were not pleased, that the cosmic order was not being properly maintained, so everything had to be perfect. Every pronunciation had to be exact. Every movement had to be precise. Every offering had to be made in exactly the right way at exactly the right moment. These ritual specialists were part of a broader priestly class that formed one of the most important groups in Egyptian society. Priests were not just religious officials. They were educated elites who could read and write, who understood mathematics and astronomy, who knew medicine and magic. Many priests came from families that had served in temples for generations, passing down knowledge from father to son, mother to daughter. The most senior priests, those who would oversee Sed Festival ceremonies, were among the most powerful people in Egypt, sometimes rivaling the pharaoh himself in wealth and influence. We can see depictions of Sed Festival crowning ceremonies in temple reliefs throughout Egypt. One particularly beautiful example comes from the tomb of an official named Keruef, who served under Amenhotep III. The reliefs in Keruf's tomb show scenes from Amenhotep III's Sed Festivals, including elaborate crowning ceremonies. In these images, we see the king sitting on his throne, wearing different crowns in different panels. We see priests approaching with ritual objects. We see musicians and dancers performing. We see long lines of officials bowing before the crowned king. These images are like freeze frames from a movie, capturing moments from ceremonies that played out over days, allowing us to reconstruct what happened even though we do not have any video or audio recordings from ancient Egypt. What is particularly striking in these reliefs is the attention to detail in how the pharaoh is dressed. His crown is precisely rendered, with every detail clearly shown. His jewelry, his collar, his bracelets, his sandals, even the texture of his kilt are all carefully depicted. This was not just artistic skill, it was magical necessity. These images were meant to allow the pharaoh to celebrate eternal Sed festivals in the afterlife, so every detail had to be correct. If the crown was depicted improperly, the spiritual recreation of the ceremony might not work. The Egyptian artists were not just making pretty pictures, they were creating functional magical tools that would operate for all eternity. The level of skill required to create these reliefs was extraordinary. Artists had to work in hard stone like limestone or granite, using copper or bronze tools since iron was not widely available in Egypt until later periods. They had to carve deep enough to make the images clear and permanent, but not so deep that they would weaken the stone. They had to maintain consistent proportions and follow the strict conventions of Egyptian art, where figures were shown in a characteristic style with heads in profile, eyes shown frontally, shoulders frontal, and legs in profile. This style, which lasted for thousands of years with only minor variations, was not due to lack of skill. Egyptian artists could create realistic portraits when they wanted to. The conventional style was chosen because it was believed to be the most magically effective way of representing people and objects. The crowning ceremonies also involved anointing the pharaoh with sacred oils and unguents. These were not ordinary perfumes. They were special mixtures made according to ancient recipes, combining expensive imported ingredients like frankincense and myrrh with local Egyptian oils and fats. The act of anointing had multiple purposes. Physically, it made the king's skin shine, literally making him glow in the sunlight or lamplight, which added to his divine appearance. Magically, the oils carried prayers and blessings into the king's body through his skin. And symbolically, anointing was an ancient Near Eastern tradition for consecrating kings, prophets, and priests, marking them as set apart for divine service. Frankincense and myrrh, the most prized ingredients in sacred oils, came from distant lands, probably from the region we now call Yemen and Somalia. These resins, harvested from specific trees, had to be transported by ship and caravan across hundreds of miles, making them extremely expensive. That the Egyptians used these precious materials in such large quantities during Sed festivals demonstrates the importance they placed on these ceremonies. Nothing was too valuable, no expense too great, when it came to renewing the pharaoh's divine power. The priests who anointed the pharaoh during his Sed Festival would recite specific prayers as they applied the sacred oils. These prayers might ask the gods to grant the king strength, to make his reign long, to keep his enemies far from Egypt's borders, to ensure abundant harvests and high Nile floods. Each prayer was not just a wish. It was, in Egyptian thinking, a real spiritual force that combined with the physical act of anointing to actually change reality. Prayer was not hoping something might happen. Prayer was making something happen through the power of correctly spoken words. This concept of the creative power of words was fundamental to Egyptian religion. In Egyptian creation myths, the world came into existence because a god spoke it into being. Words, especially when spoken by someone with the proper authority and knowledge, had real power to shape reality. This is why the exact pronunciation of prayers was so important. A mispronounced word might not just fail to work. It might actively cause harm, warping reality in unintended ways. The priests who performed Sed Festival rituals carried an enormous responsibility. They were not just going through motions. They were actively maintaining the structure of the universe through the correct use of sacred language. After the crowning and anointing, the newly renewed pharaoh would receive the adoration and submission of his court. Officials would approach in strict order of rank, each making gestures of respect and speaking formulas of loyalty. Provincial governors would promise to keep their regions peaceful and productive. Military commanders would vow to defend Egypt against all threats. Priests would assure the king of the gods' favour. This part of the ceremony served important political functions, reminding every powerful person in Egypt that their authority came from the pharaoh, that they served at his pleasure, that his renewal was their renewal because their positions depended on his continued strength. These pledges of loyalty were not empty words. In ancient Egypt, words spoken during sacred ceremonies were binding in ways that went beyond mere social convention. Breaking an oath made during a Sed Festival would not just be politically unwise, it would be a violation of cosmic order, an offence against Ma'at that would bring punishment from the gods. The officials making these pledges understood that they were entering into contracts that had spiritual as well as political force. Yet despite all the grand symbolism and political manoeuvring, there was something profoundly personal about the crowning ceremonies of the Sed Festival. This was a man, regardless of his divine status, being recognized and honored for having successfully ruled for 30 years or more. That was an achievement worthy of celebration by any measure. The crowns, the thrones, the crook and flail, the oils and prayers, all of these were ways of saying, "Well done. You have carried an impossible burden for decades, and you are still here, still strong, still capable. The gods approve of you. The people depend on you. Continue as you have begun, and may your reign last for millions of years." There is something deeply moving in these ancient ceremonies when you think about them as human experiences rather than just historical curiosities. Imagine being that pharaoh, sitting on your throne after the exhausting ceremonial run, feeling the cool touch of sacred oil on your forehead, hearing the ancient prayers chanted in your honor, seeing the faces of your officials as they bow before you. You have proven yourself once again. You have earned the right to continue. For at least a few more years, the weight of Egypt rests securely on your shoulders. And despite the enormous responsibility, despite the constant pressure, there must be satisfaction in knowing you have measured up to the impossible standards required of a god-king. Let your mind rest now in one of those quiet moments between Sed Festival rituals. The pharaoh sits in a side chamber, away from the crowds and ceremonies for just a moment. He has removed his crown, and a servant is bringing him cool water flavoured with honey and pomegranate. Outside, in the festival court, preparations continue for the next ritual, but in here there is brief peace. The king closes his eyes, and perhaps, just perhaps, he allows himself a slight smile. He has run his course. He has received his crowns. He has proven himself to gods and men. And tomorrow he will rise and do it all again, because that is what it means to be Pharaoh. That is what it means to maintain Ma'at. That is what it means to be the bridge between heaven and earth, the shepherd of millions, the living embodiment of order in a world that constantly threatens to slide into chaos. The walls of the chamber are decorated with painted scenes showing the pharaoh in his various aspects, as warrior defeating enemies, as priest making offerings to the gods, as hunter displaying his prowess, as wise administrator dispensing justice. These images remind him of who he is and what he has accomplished. They also serve a magical function, reinforcing his identity and power even in these quiet moments. Nothing in a pharaoh's life is without meaning. Even rest is a ritual, a necessary part of the cycle that allows him to continue performing his divine duties. A light breeze moves through the chamber, carrying with it the scent of lotus flowers from the palace gardens and the distant sound of music from the festival preparations. The pharaoh breathes deeply, letting the tension flow out of his body. Tomorrow there will be more ceremonies, more rituals, more tests of his fitness and worthiness. But for now, in this moment, he can simply be. He can rest in the knowledge that he has done what was required, that the gods are pleased, that Egypt is safe, that the ancient traditions continue unbroken, and that when he dies, perhaps many years from now, he will join the eternal company of justified pharaohs who ruled well and maintained Ma'at throughout their reigns. This thought brings him peace, and he finishes his honey water, rises, allows himself to be dressed once more in ceremonial regalia, and prepares to return to the festival court where his people and his gods await him. Chapter 5. The Dance of the Gods. The Raising of the Djed. Among all the rituals of the Sed Festival, one of the most visually spectacular and symbolically rich was the raising of the Djed pillar. This ceremony, usually performed toward the end of the festival celebrations, brought together multiple layers of Egyptian religious thought into a single dramatic act that linked the pharaoh to Osiris, the god of death and resurrection, and to the eternal cycles of death and rebirth that governed all existence. The Djed pillar itself is one of the most recognizable symbols in Egyptian art. You have almost certainly seen it, even if you did not know what it was called. It looks like a column with a broad base, a shaft, and 4 or 5 horizontal bars near the top, giving it an appearance somewhat like a stylized tree, or perhaps a backbone. And indeed, by the New Kingdom period, the Djed was explicitly identified as the backbone of Osiris, though it probably had earlier meanings as well, possibly representing a pole with sheaves of grain attached to it, symbolizing agricultural abundance and renewal. Osiris was one of the most important gods in the Egyptian pantheon, and his story was central to Egyptian beliefs about death, resurrection, and eternal life. According to the myth, Osiris was once a living king who ruled Egypt in a golden age of prosperity and wisdom. His brother Set, jealous of Osiris's success and popularity, murdered him, dismembering his body and scattering the pieces across Egypt. Osiris's faithful wife Isis searched for the pieces, gathered them together, and through powerful magic restored Osiris to life, though not to the living world. Instead, Osiris became ruler of the underworld, the judge of the dead, the king of the afterlife. The myth of Osiris resonated deeply with Egyptians on multiple levels. It explained the cycle of the seasons, with Osiris's death representing the dry season when vegetation died, and his resurrection representing the flood season when life returned to the land. It provided a model for how to deal with death, showing that through proper ritual and moral living, one could overcome death and achieve eternal life. And it established the fundamental principle that death was not an ending, but a transition to a different form of existence. The Djed pillar, as Osiris's backbone, represented his resurrection, his standing up again after being struck down. When the Djed was lying horizontal, it symbolized death, the collapse of life force. When it was raised vertical, it represented resurrection, the triumph of life over death, the restoration of order after chaos. This symbolism made the Djed pillar perfect for the Sed Festival, which was itself all about renewal and the continuation of life force. The ceremony of raising the Djed took place in the festival court with the pharaoh, priests, and important officials all participating. The Djed pillar, which could be quite large and heavy, sometimes as tall as a man or taller, would begin the ceremony lying flat on the ground. Priests would surround it, taking hold of ropes attached to it. The pharaoh, sometimes assisted by designated helpers, would grasp the main rope or the pillar itself. Then, as special prayers and chants were performed, everyone would pull together to raise the pillar vertical until it stood upright, firmly planted in its base. The physical act of raising the heavy pillar required coordination and strength, and the pharaoh's participation in this labor was significant. Despite his divine status, despite normally never being required to perform physical work, here he was, pulling on ropes like a common laborer. This was deliberate. By helping to raise the Djed, the pharaoh was symbolically raising Osiris, helping to resurrect the god, and through this act, ensuring his own eventual resurrection. It was a gesture of humility before the gods combined with an assertion of power. The king was saying, "I am strong enough not just to rule the living but to influence the realm of the dead. I am connected to Osiris. What happened to him will happen to me. I will die, but I will rise again." The moment when the Djed pillar reached vertical and locked into place must have been electrifying. The crowd would cheer. Musicians would play triumphant music on harps, drums, sistrums, and flutes. Dancers would begin performing choreographed movements that told the story of Osiris's death and resurrection through their bodies. The pharaoh would step back, breathing heavily from the exertion, and watch as the pillar stood firm, pointing toward the sky like a bridge between earth and heaven. The raising of the Djed also had connections to agricultural cycles. In the earliest versions of this ritual, before it was fully connected to Osiris, the Djed might have represented the last sheaf of grain from the harvest, which would be kept throughout the year and then ceremonially raised to mark the beginning of the new agricultural cycle. This link to agriculture made perfect sense in Egyptian terms because the pharaoh was responsible for the fertility of the land. The Nile's flood, which brought the water and nutrient-rich silt that made Egyptian agriculture possible, was believed to be influenced by the pharaoh's relationship with the gods. A strong king in good standing with the divine powers would ensure good floods and bountiful harvests. A weak king might see the Nile fail, bringing famine and disaster, so when the pharaoh raised the Djed pillar during his Sed Festival, he was not just enacting a myth about Osiris. He was performing practical magic intended to maintain agricultural abundance. He was telling the land, "Rise up, be fertile, produce abundantly. Just as this pillar rises, so shall the Nile rise at its appointed time. Just as Osiris rose from death, so shall the grain rise from the planted seed. Just as I stand renewed before you, so shall Egypt stand strong and prosperous for generations to come." The prayers and chants that accompanied the raising of the Djed have been preserved in some Egyptian texts, and they are hauntingly beautiful. They speak of stability, endurance, the overcoming of enemies, the establishment of order. One prayer might say, "The Osiris is raised, the Djed stands firm, the king is renewed. His years are multiplied, his reign extends to the limits of the sky. Chaos is overthrown. Ma'at is established. The two lands rejoice. The gods are content. The people are prosperous. The Nile brings its bounty. The grain grows tall. The cattle multiply. The workshops produce fine goods. The borders are secure. The enemies are far. The ancestors are pleased. The future is assured. All praise to the Pharaoh, whose strength has raised the Djed, whose wisdom has renewed the land, whose divine nature has bridged the gap between mortal and eternal. Once the Djed pillar was fully upright, it would be secured in place, sometimes in a special base or socket carved into the stone floor. The erected pillar would then remain standing for the duration of the festival and sometimes beyond, serving as a visible reminder of the renewal that had taken place. In some depictions, we see multiple Djed pillars raised during a single Sed Festival, possibly representing different aspects of the king's power or different regions of Egypt, all being renewed simultaneously. The raising of the Djed was often accompanied by elaborate music and dancing. The role of music in Sed Festival ceremonies cannot be overstated. Music was not entertainment or background noise. It was an essential component of the ritual, a tool for reaching altered states of consciousness, for communicating with the divine, for creating the sacred atmosphere in which magic could work. Musicians would play drums of various sizes, creating rhythms that could range from slow and stately to fast and driving. The drums were made from animal skin stretched over pottery or wooden frames, and skilled drummers could produce a wide variety of tones by striking different parts of the drumhead. Flutes made from reeds produced haunting melodies. Harps, which came in various sizes from small lap harps to large floor harps taller than a person, provided harmonic support and melodic lines. The harp was associated with the goddess Hathor, and playing it was a form of worship that pleased her and called upon her benevolent power. The sistrum was perhaps the most important ritual instrument. This rattle, sacred to Hathor, consisted of a handle attached to a frame containing metal rods that created a gentle shaking sound when the instrument was moved. The sound of the sistrum was believed to please the gods and to drive away evil spirits. Priestesses would shake sistrums throughout Sed Festival ceremonies, creating a constant background of divine sound that sanctified the space and actions. The sistrum sound, described in ancient texts as like rain falling or like the rustle of papyrus plants in the wind, had a hypnotic quality that helped both performers and observers enter the state of consciousness necessary for sacred ritual. Dancers would perform, their movements telling the story of Osiris's death and resurrection through choreography that had been passed down through generations. These dances were not entertainment in the modern sense. They were ritual acts that helped make the magic work. Through movement, through gesture, through the positioning of bodies in space, the dancers were helping to channel divine energy and reshape reality. Each gesture had meaning. Each step was precisely choreographed. The dancers were not expressing themselves as individuals. They were serving as vessels for divine forces, allowing the gods to manifest through their bodies. Female dancers seem to have played a particularly important role in Sed Festival celebrations. In the reliefs from Amenhotep III's festivals, we see elaborate depictions of women dancers performing in flowing garments, their arms raised, their bodies bent in graceful curves, their hair swinging as they moved. These women might have been priestesses, trained in sacred dance as a form of worship and magic, or they might have been members of the royal household, honoured with the privilege of participating in these crucial ceremonies. Either way, their presence added another dimension to the festival, connecting the renewal of the king to feminine divine powers associated with creation, birth, and regeneration. The goddess Hathor, in particular, was closely associated with music, dance, and celebration. She was sometimes called the Lady of Drunkenness, not because she encouraged irresponsible behavior, but because in ancient Egypt, controlled intoxication, achieved through beer or wine, was understood as a way of reaching altered states of consciousness that allowed communion with the divine. Hathor's festivals included music, dancing, and the consumption of large quantities of beer, all in service of reaching a state where the boundaries between human and divine became permeable. During the Sed Festival, invoking Hathor through music and dance served multiple purposes. It created an atmosphere of joy and celebration, transforming the serious rituals into moments of divine pleasure. It called upon Hathor's power of regeneration and renewal, asking her to bless the pharaoh with continued vitality, and it created a bridge between the human participants and the divine realm, allowing the gods to be present in a more immediate and powerful way than would otherwise be possible. The raising of the Djed also had cosmic significance. The vertical pillar, standing firm against the sky, represented the axis mundi, the cosmic axis around which the universe rotates. In many ancient cultures, there was a concept of a world tree or world mountain or world pillar that connected heaven and earth, serving as a channel through which divine power could flow into the mortal world. The Djed pillar served this function in Egyptian cosmology. When it was raised during the Sed Festival, it was opening a pathway between the gods and the king, allowing divine energy to pour into the pharaoh, renewing his strength and his legitimacy. This concept of the axis mundi appears in cultures around the world, suggesting that it reflects something deep in human psychology about how we understand the relationship between earth and sky, between mortal and divine, between here and there. The vertical line connects what is below with what is above, creating a channel for communication and power. By raising the Djed pillar, the Egyptians were creating a temporary cosmic axis that allowed direct contact between the earthly realm of the pharaoh and the celestial realm of the gods. Some scholars have noted interesting parallels between the raising of the Djed and certain later religious traditions. The raising of a sacred pole or tree is found in many cultures' renewal festivals. The maypole dances of European spring celebrations, though separated from Egyptian practice by thousands of years and thousands of miles, share that basic structure of raising a vertical pole to mark renewal and fertility. This suggests that the impulse behind the Djed raising ceremony reflects something universal in human experience, a recognition that life force can be visualized as something that flows vertically, rising from earth towards sky, and that by enacting this rising through ritual, we can participate in and encourage the renewal of life itself. After the Djed was raised, the pharaoh would perform additional rituals around it. He might make offerings at its base, pouring libations of water representing the Nile, wine representing joy and celebration, or milk representing nourishment and motherly care. He might burn incense, creating fragrant smoke that would rise toward the sky, carrying prayers to the gods. He might present food offerings to Osiris, acknowledging the god's lordship over the realm of the dead and asking for his blessing and protection. The pharaoh might also touch the pillar, placing his hands on it and standing in silence for a moment, transferring its symbolic power into his own body, taking its strength and stability into himself. This direct physical contact with the Djed was important. It was not enough for the pillar to be raised. The pharaoh had to connect with it personally, to establish a relationship with this symbol of Osirian power and resurrection. The identification between the pharaoh and Osiris was one of the most important concepts in Egyptian royal ideology. Every pharaoh, when he died, became Osiris, but the connection went deeper than that. Even in life, the pharaoh was seen as a form of Osiris, or more precisely, as Osiris's son Horus during his lifetime, transforming fully into Osiris upon death. The Sed Festival's Osiris-centered rituals like the raising of the Djed reinforced this identification. They reminded everyone watching that the king was not just a powerful human being, he was a god incarnate, following in the footsteps of the divine rulers who had governed Egypt since the creation of the world. This connection to Osiris also meant that the Sed Festival had overtones of death and resurrection, even while celebrating life and continued rule. The festival was, in a sense, a rehearsal for the pharaoh's actual death and hoped-for resurrection in the afterlife. By symbolically dying and being reborn during the Sed Festival, by raising the Djed pillar associated with Osiris's resurrection, The king was preparing the way for his eventual triumphant passage through death into eternal life as an effective spirit in the realm of the gods. There is something paradoxical but profound here. The festival that celebrated the king's continued life and vigor was also the festival that most explicitly acknowledged his inevitable death. Rather than trying to ignore death or pretend it would not come, the Egyptians built acknowledgement of death right into their celebration of life. The raising of the Djed said, "Yes, death will come," as it came to Osiris. But death is not the end. What was struck down will rise again. What seems lost will be restored. The cycle continues forever. This acceptance of death as part of a larger cycle, rather than as a final ending, gave Egyptian civilization a kind of philosophical stability that helped it endure for 3,000 years. They were not trying to prevent death, which would be impossible. They were trying to ensure that death led to resurrection, that the cycle turned properly, that what came after death would be life again, renewed and eternal. As you rest here, listening to these words, picture the moment when the Djed pillar clicks into its vertical position. The priests release their ropes. The pharaoh steps back, nodding with satisfaction. The pillar stands firm, pointing toward the sky like a finger connecting earth to heaven. Drummers begin a rhythmic beating, slower now, steady and strong like a heartbeat. Dancers sway, their movements becoming gentler, more flowing, celebrating the successful completion of the ritual. The pharaoh approaches the pillar one more time, places both hands upon it, closes his eyes, and speaks a silent prayer to Osiris. "I have raised your backbone. I have restored you. Now grant me your blessing. Let me stand as firm as this pillar. Let my reign be as enduring as this symbol of eternity. Let me, like you, triumph over death and live forever in the presence of the gods. Let Egypt prosper under my rule. Let the Nile flood abundantly. Let the grain grow tall. Let the people be happy. Let Ma'at prevail. Let my name be remembered forever, not just in the land of the living, but in the eternal realm where you rule, great Osiris, Lord of the West, King of the dead, hope of the resurrection." The sun is setting now over the festival court. The Djed pillar casts a long shadow across the stone pavement, pointing east toward the rising place of the sun. Tomorrow the sun will rise again, as it always does, and the festivals will continue. But for now, as twilight gathers, there is this perfect moment of stillness and completion. The pillar stands. The pharaoh stands. Egypt stands. The cycle continues. All is well. Chapter 6. The feast, the offerings, and the communion with gods. No ancient Egyptian ceremony was complete without elaborate offerings to the gods, and the Sed Festival featured some of the most extensive offering rituals in all of Egyptian religious practice. For days, the temples would be filled with the scent of incense, the sight of piled food offerings, and the sound of prayers as priests worked to ensure that every deity, major and minor, received their proper share of offerings and attention. The scale of these offerings is difficult for us to comprehend today. We are not talking about a few symbolic items. We are talking about tons of food, thousands of loaves of bread baked fresh each morning, countless jars of beer brewed according to ancient recipes, mountains of vegetables and fruit brought from gardens and orchards throughout Egypt, whole herds of cattle led to slaughter, flocks of geese and ducks, and enormous quantities of luxury items like incense imported from distant lands, perfumes blended according to sacred formulas, bolts of finest white linen, and precious metals shaped into ritual objects. The logistics of organizing these offerings must have been staggering. Whole departments of the royal administration would have worked for months in advance, calculating how much of everything would be needed, arranging for it to be produced or purchased, coordinating transport to wherever the festival was being held, and managing storage and preparation. Why were such massive offerings necessary? The Egyptians believed that the gods needed nourishment just like humans did. Of course, the gods did not literally eat the physical food that was offered to them. Instead, they consumed the spiritual essence of the offerings, the ka of the food and drink. But this spiritual consumption required that real, physical offerings be made. You could not fool the gods with fake food or empty promises. Everything had to be actual, tangible, properly prepared according to ancient specifications. The offering rituals of the Sed Festival would begin each day at dawn, when the first rays of sunlight touched the eastern horizon. Dawn was the moment of daily creation in Egyptian cosmology, when the sun god Ra was reborn from the womb of the sky goddess Nut, beginning his journey across the sky in his solar boat. Making offerings at dawn aligned human actions with this cosmic event, suggesting that just as the sun was renewed each day, so too was the pharaoh being renewed through his Sed Festival. Priests would enter the inner sanctuaries of temples carrying trays of food, jars of beer, bowls of milk, bundles of flowers, and blocks of incense. They would place these offerings before the cult statues of the gods, those sacred images that served as the earthly vessels for divine presence. As they placed each offering, they would recite specific prayers, stating what the offering was and asking the god to accept it. Behold, I bring you bread, the bread of life, made from the finest wheat of Egypt, ground by skilled hands, baked in sacred ovens, blessed by priests, offered with pure intentions. I bring you beer, the beer of rejoicing, brewed from barley blessed by the gods, fermented to perfection, strained through finest linen, poured with reverence. I bring you meat from the finest cattle, raised on the rich grasses of the delta, slaughtered according to proper ritual, prepared by hands that know the sacred ways. I bring you milk from sacred cows, honey gathered from the sacred bees of Lower Egypt, fruits from the gardens of the gods, flowers whose fragrance pleases the divine senses. Accept these offerings, great God. Be nourished, be content, be strong. Extend your blessing to Pharaoh, who provides all these good things for you through his wisdom, his power, and his devotion. After the gods had spiritually consumed the offerings, the physical items would be removed and distributed to the priests who had performed the rituals, and then to other temple personnel, and finally to others according to a complex hierarchy of entitlement. This system meant that nobody really lost the food offered to the gods. The material nourishment circulated through the temple community and beyond, while the spiritual essence had been consumed by the deities. It was an efficient system that honored the gods, while also feeding a large portion of the Egyptian population. Temple complexes were like huge redistribution centers, taking in agricultural products as offerings and taxes, offering them to the gods, and then redistributing them to support priests, craftsmen, workers, and the poor. During the Sed Festival, the pharaoh himself would participate in making offerings, not just leaving it entirely to the priests. This was important because it demonstrated that the king, despite his exalted status, was humble before the gods. It also reinforced his role as the chief priest of Egypt, the ultimate intermediary between human and divine realms. When the pharaoh personally placed bread before the statue of Amun-Ra, when he poured water for Osiris, when he lit incense for Hathor, he was performing his most fundamental royal duty, maintaining the relationship between Egypt and its gods. The offerings made during the Sed Festival were not just about feeding the gods, they were also about reaffirming cosmic order. Each offering represented the abundance of Egypt, the productivity of the land, the successful functioning of the economy and society. By presenting these offerings to the gods, the pharaoh was saying, "Look at what Egypt has produced under my rule. The land is fertile, the people are fed, the workshops produce beautiful things. We have surplus to give generously to the gods. This proves that my rule is successful, that I am maintaining Ma'at, that the cosmic order is intact." The variety of offerings was also significant. Gods had different preferences, and the Sed Festival offerings had to take this into account. Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, music, and joy, particularly appreciated offerings of wine and sweet foods like cakes made with dates and honey. Sekhmet, the fierce lion goddess who could bring plague but also healing, preferred blood offerings and meat from freshly slaughtered animals. Ptah, the creator god associated with craftsmen and artisans, valued offerings of fine metalwork, intricate sculptures, and beautifully made tools. Thoth, god of wisdom and writing, appreciated offerings of papyrus, writing materials, and scrolls containing sacred texts. Anubis, god of mummification and guardian of the necropolis, received offerings of natron salt and linen, the materials used in preserving the dead. By providing the appropriate offerings to each deity, the pharaoh demonstrated his knowledge of the proper forms, his respect for each god's individual nature, and his ability to satisfy all the divine powers of Egypt simultaneously. Special offerings were made to the royal ancestors during the Sed Festival, the spirits of previous pharaohs, who were believed to be active and interested in the affairs of Egypt even after death, received offerings and prayers asking for their support and blessing. The reigning pharaoh would invoke the names of great kings of the past: Nama, who united Egypt; Djoser, who built the first pyramid; Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid; Thutmose III, who expanded Egypt's empire, and many others. He was connecting himself to this lineage, claiming his place in the unbroken chain of legitimate rulers. By honoring his predecessors and asking for their approval, he was reinforcing his own legitimacy. Palm ribs played an interesting role in Sed Festival offerings. These were the woody central stalks of palm leaves, stripped of their leafy parts, and they had symbolic significance related to time and years. The Egyptians used notches carved on palm ribs as one way of counting years, with each notch representing a year that had passed. During the Sed Festival, bundles of palm ribs would be offered to the pharaoh by the gods, symbolically granting him additional years of life and rule. Images from temple reliefs show deities like Thoth and Seshat presenting palm ribs to the king, with hieroglyphic captions proclaiming things like hundreds of thousands of years of life, or years as numerous as the stars in the sky, or may you rule for millions of jubilees. These offerings of palm ribs were a form of sympathetic magic. By presenting the king with symbols representing years, the gods were granting him those years in reality. The more palm ribs offered, the longer the pharaoh would live and rule. The offering ceremonies were accompanied by elaborate music and singing. Temple choirs would perform hymns praising the gods and the pharaoh. These were not simple songs. They were complex compositions with multiple vocal parts, carefully composed poetry set to traditional melodies that had been performed for centuries. The words praised the attributes of the gods, recounted their mythological deeds, described their power and benevolence, and asked for their blessings upon Egypt and its king. Some of these hymns have survived in Egyptian texts, and modern scholars and musicians have attempted to reconstruct how they might have sounded, though of course we cannot be entirely certain since musical notation as we know it did not exist in ancient Egypt. Instruments used in Sed Festival music included harps ranging from small handheld instruments to large elaborate harps taller than a person with dozens of strings. These harps were often beautifully decorated, with sound boxes carved to resemble papyrus skiffs or painted with images of gods and goddesses. Playing the harp was considered a sacred act, particularly pleasing to Hathor. Flutes made from reeds produced haunting melodies that could sound mournful or joyful depending on how they were played. Drums of various sizes provided rhythmic foundation, from small hand drums that could be played with fingers to large drums that required striking with sticks. Clappers created sharp, rhythmic accents by striking two pieces of wood or ivory together. And sistrums, those sacred rattles of Hathor, provided a constant shaking sound that sanctified the entire ritual space. The combination of these instruments, along with human voices in multiple parts, would have created a soundscape quite unlike anything in modern music, something that would sound exotic and ancient to our ears if we could somehow hear it today. It would have been complex but not harmonically sophisticated in the way Western music became after the development of counterpoint and harmony. Instead, Egyptian music probably featured melodic lines played in unison or octaves, with rhythmic complexity and timbral variety providing the main interest. One particularly important offering during the Sed Festival was the Eye of Horus, a symbol that represented completeness, healing, and protection. The myth behind this symbol tells how the god Horus fought with Set to avenge his father Osiris's murder. During this battle, Horus lost his eye, which was torn to pieces by Set in the violence of their combat. The eye was later restored by the god Thoth, who gathered all the pieces and magically made it whole again. The restored Eye of Horus became a powerful symbol of healing, restoration, and the overcoming of damage and disorder. When the Eye of Horus was offered to the pharaoh during his Sed Festival, the symbolism was clear and powerful. Just as Horus's eye was restored after being damaged, so too was the pharaoh being restored after the wear and tear of 30 years of rule. He was receiving back his full strength, his complete vitality, his perfect fitness to rule. The offering of the Eye of Horus was therefore one of the most magically potent acts of the entire festival, a concrete representation of the renewal that the entire ceremony was designed to achieve. The culmination of the offering ceremonies often came with a great feast, where the pharaoh would ceremonially consume some of the offerings that had been presented to the gods. This was not merely dining. This was a form of communion, an act that created a tangible connection between the king and the gods. By eating food that had been offered to the deities and accepted by them, the pharaoh was taking divine essence into his body. He was becoming more godlike with every bite. The god's Ka, their life force, was mingling with his own Ka, strengthening and renewing him from within. This concept of communion through shared food is found in many religious traditions throughout history, but the Egyptians developed it in their own particular way. The Sed Festival feast was not just about the pharaoh eating. It was about creating a network of connections. The land produced food, the people prepared it, the king offered it to the gods accepted and blessed it, the king consumed it, and in doing so, took the god's blessing into himself, which enabled him to continue protecting the land and the people, which allowed the land to continue producing food, completing the cycle. Special ritual bread and beer featured prominently in Sed Festival feasts. These were not ordinary sustenance. They were made according to sacred recipes using the finest ingredients, blessed at every stage of preparation. The bread might be shaped into specific forms, each with its own symbolic meaning. Some loaves might be shaped like the hieroglyph for offering. Others might be moulded into the forms of animals sacred to particular gods. Bulls for Apis, falcons for Horus, lions for Sekhmet. The beer, which was a staple drink in ancient Egypt, brewed much thicker and more nutritious than modern beer, might be flavoured with dates or honey, and offered in specially decorated jars inscribed with prayers and protective spells. As you continue to relax, imagine yourself present at one of these offering ceremonies. You stand in a side chamber of a temple, watching as a long procession of priests enters, each carrying offerings. The air is thick with frankincense smoke, which rises in lazy spirals toward the ceiling, painted with stars to represent the night sky. The late afternoon sun slants through high windows, creating beams of light that make the smoke glow golden. A choir chants somewhere deeper in the temple, their voices echoing off stone walls in a sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Priest after priest approaches the altar, places offerings with reverent gestures, bows deeply, and withdraws. The pile of offerings grows higher, bread still warm from the ovens, fruit arranged in perfect pyramids, flowers releasing their fragrance into the incense-heavy air, jars of beer with foam still on top, cuts of meat from animals slaughtered this morning, bolts of linen so white they seem to glow, precious oils in delicate alabaster containers. And presiding over it all is the pharaoh in his Sed Festival regalia, his white crown rising toward the ceiling, his false beard of divine kingship projecting from his chin, his crook and flail crossed over his chest. Occasionally he reaches forward to place a particularly important offering himself, his movements deliberate and precise, every gesture carrying the weight of 3,000 years of tradition. When he places bread before the god's statue, he murmurs a prayer that only he and the god can hear. When he pours water, it makes a musical sound as it splashes into the offering bowl. When he lights incense, he watches the smoke rise, reading its patterns like a message from the divine realm. The offerings continue as the sun sets and lamps are lit throughout the temple. Oil lamps in bronze stands cast flickering light that makes the carved relief images seem to move, seem almost alive. The ceremony flows on like the Nile itself, constant and life-giving. And you understand, watching this, that what is happening here is more than religious duty or political theatre. It is the maintenance of reality itself, the active working of magic and prayer and offering that keeps the world in proper balance, that ensures the sun will rise tomorrow, that guarantees the Nile will flood when it should, that protects Egypt from chaos and preserves the divine order established at the creation of the world. The offerings are not gifts to capricious deities who must be bribed into behaving well. They are the fuel that keeps the cosmic engine running, the oil that lubricates the gears of existence, the sustenance that allows the gods to continue performing their vital functions of maintaining the universe. And the pharaoh is the engineer who ensures everything functions smoothly, year after year, decade after decade, for millions of years to come. Without him, without these offerings, without these carefully performed rituals, the whole system might collapse. The sun might not rise, the Nile might not flood, the dead might not be resurrected. Chaos might overwhelm order. So the offerings must continue. The rituals must be performed correctly. The pharaoh must maintain his strength and his devotion. Everything depends on this. Deep into the night, long after ordinary people have gone to sleep, the offering ceremonies continue. This is the sacred time, the hours when the boundary between day and night, between life and death, between human and divine, becomes thinner and more permeable. This is when the most powerful magic can be worked. The pharaoh, despite his exhaustion after days of ceremonies, remains alert and focused. He has been anointed with oils that sharpen consciousness. He has consumed sacred foods that provide energy. He is supported by the presence of the gods themselves, who have descended into their statues to witness and accept these offerings. He can feel their presence, vast and ancient and powerful, pressing against his awareness. He is not alone. He has never been alone. He is surrounded by divine forces that have sustained Egypt since before time began, and he is their chosen instrument, their voice, their hands, their presence in the mortal world. Finally, as the first hint of dawn begins to lighten the eastern sky, the offering ceremonies conclude. The pharaoh makes one final offering of incense, one final prayer, one final bow before the gods. The priests chant a closing hymn, and it is done. The gods are satisfied. Egypt is secure. The cycle continues. Tomorrow there will be more ceremonies, but tonight's work is complete. The pharaoh withdraws to his private chambers, and as he finally allows himself to rest, he carries with him the knowledge that he has fulfilled his most sacred duty. He has fed the gods. He has maintained Ma'at. He has ensured that the universe will continue for at least one more day, one more year, one more cycle of renewal, and that is enough. Chapter 7. The witnesses, the participants, and the living history. The Sed Festival was not performed in private. It required witnesses, both human and divine, and understanding who participated in these ceremonies and why gives us deep insight into how ancient Egyptian society was organized and how power was distributed and legitimated. The most important human witnesses were the high priests of Egypt's major temples. Egypt had a complex religious landscape with many different gods worshipped at different cult centers throughout the country. Amun-Ra at Thebes, Ptah at Memphis, Ra at Heliopolis, Hathor at Dendera, Osiris at Abydos, Sobek at Crocodilopolis, and many others each had large temple complexes with staffs of priests who maintained the daily rituals for their particular deity. During a Sed festival, representatives from all these major temples would gather, traveling sometimes for days by boat along the Nile, bringing with them the spiritual authority of their gods and the political influence of their temples. These priests were not merely observers, they were active participants who performed many of the rituals, recited the prayers, made the offerings, and provided the ritual expertise that made the festival work. The pharaoh, despite being considered a god himself, did not have the specialized knowledge needed to perform every aspect of the complex ceremonies. He relied on professional priests who had trained for years or decades in the precise words and actions required for each ritual. These priests were repositories of ancient knowledge, guardians of traditions that had been passed down through countless generations, sometimes within priestly families that had served the same temple for centuries. The high priests also served as representatives of their gods in a very literal sense. When the high priest of Amun-Ra spoke during the Sed festival, it was believed that he was speaking with the authority of Amun-Ra himself. When the high priest of Ptah performed a ritual action, it was as if Ptah was performing that action through him. This gave the priests enormous authority and also enormous responsibility. A mistake by a priest was not just a human error. It was a failure in the proper maintenance of cosmic order, a breach in the relationship between Egypt and the divine powers that sustained it. Beyond the priests, the nobility of Egypt would also attend Sed festivals. These were the governors of provinces, called nomarchs, who ruled over the various administrative districts into which Egypt was divided. These were the commanders of military forces, the generals who defended Egypt's borders and led campaigns into foreign lands. These were the highest officials of the royal administration, the viziers and treasurers and overseers who managed the complex bureaucracy that kept Egypt functioning. Their presence at the Sed festival served multiple purposes. First, it was an honor to witness the renewal of the pharaoh's power. Being invited to attend the Sed festival was a mark of high status and royal favor. The pharaoh could control who was invited, using the guest list as a way of rewarding loyalty and punishing disloyalty. An official who expected an invitation but did not receive one would understand this as a clear message of royal displeasure. Second, their attendance was a public demonstration of loyalty. By coming to the festival, by participating in ceremonies that acknowledged the pharaoh's divine right to rule, they were reaffirming their submission to his authority. They were publicly declaring before gods and humans that they recognized the pharaoh as their legitimate ruler, that they owed him obedience and service. Third, the festival provided an opportunity for the king to meet with his most powerful subjects, to gauge their loyalty, to distribute favors and honors, and to keep the complex networks of Egyptian politics running smoothly. The Sed festival was not just a religious event. It was also a political summit where the most important people in Egypt gathered in one place, providing the pharaoh with an opportunity to manage relationships, to resolve disputes, to make alliances, and to demonstrate his power and wisdom. The Sed festival was one of the few occasions when people from all over Egypt would gather in one place. Egypt was a large country, stretching for hundreds of miles along the Nile, and travel was slow even by boat on the river, which was the main highway of the country. Most people lived their entire lives without traveling more than a few miles from where they were born. But the Sed Festival drew people from the southernmost borders near Nubia to the northern edges of the delta, where the Nile met the Mediterranean Sea. It was a rare moment of national unity, when the two lands were literally brought together in one place, when Upper and Lower Egypt existed not just as concepts but as gathering of real people who could see and interact with each other. For the common people of Egypt, the Sed Festival was experienced mostly indirectly. They would not have been allowed into the sacred precincts where the main rituals took place. Those areas were restricted to the pharaoh, the priests, and the highest officials. Ordinary people could not enter temple sanctuaries even during normal times, much less during the most sacred ceremonies of the Sed Festival. But the festival still affected ordinary Egyptians' lives in significant ways. Extra rations might be distributed to celebrate the royal jubilee. Work requirements might be reduced, giving people time to celebrate in their own communities. Local festivals and celebrations would be held throughout Egypt to mark the occasion. People would go to their local temples to offer prayers for the pharaoh's continued health and success, even if they could not witness the main ceremonies themselves. In some cases, artisans and craftsmen would be commissioned to create special items for the Sed Festival. Ritual objects needed for the ceremonies, offerings to be presented to the gods, decorations for temples and palace spaces, ceremonial clothing for the pharaoh and priests. This would provide work and income for these craftspeople and their families. Farmers would provide the animals and crops used in offerings, receiving payment from the royal treasury. Brewers and bakers would work overtime, producing the enormous quantities of beer and bread needed for offerings and for feeding the crowds of officials and priests. In this way, preparing for and celebrating a Sed Festival stimulated the entire Egyptian economy, much like preparations for a modern Olympics or World's Fair might do. The most privileged spectators at a Sed Festival were members of the royal family. The pharaoh's wives, his children both legitimate and otherwise, his siblings, and other close relatives would have prominent places at major ceremonies. Some of them might have active roles. Queens and princesses sometimes served as priestesses of Hathor and would participate in rituals associated with that goddess, performing music, dancing, and shaking sistrums. Royal sons, especially the crown prince who would eventually inherit the throne, he would pay very close attention to every detail of the festival, because one day they might celebrate their own Sed Festival and would need to know how everything was done. The presence of the royal family at the Sed Festival was not just about family participation in an important event. It was also a political statement about succession and legitimacy. By prominently displaying his children and heirs, the pharaoh was demonstrating that the royal line would continue, that Egypt's future was secure. He was also giving his chosen successor visibility and legitimacy, allowing the court and the people to see who would likely be the next pharaoh and to begin accepting that person's future role. One particularly important category of witnesses was the royal officials charged with recording the festival. Ancient Egypt had a sophisticated administrative system that kept detailed records of everything from grain harvests to battle victories to temple offerings. The Sed Festival was certainly recorded in royal annals and temple archives, though unfortunately, most of these papyrus records have not survived 3,000 years of time. What we do have are the temple reliefs and tomb decorations that depict Sed Festival scenes, and these provide invaluable information that has allowed scholars to reconstruct what these ancient ceremonies involved. The officials who commissioned and supervised these artistic records were ensuring that the festival would not be forgotten. They were creating permanent documentation that would last for eternity, allowing future generations and the gods themselves to witness what had taken place. This was not just about preserving history for historical purposes. It was about preserving magic. The reliefs and paintings were not merely decorative. They were functional magical tools that allowed the depicted rituals to continue operating forever, in the spiritual realm. As long as the images remained, the pharaoh could celebrate his Sed Festival eternally in the afterlife. Artists and sculptors who created Sed Festival imagery held an important but somewhat paradoxical position in Egyptian society. They were craftsmen, which put them relatively low in the social hierarchy, certainly well below priests and nobles, and even below scribes. Yet they were also creating sacred objects with real magical power. The images they carved and painted were not art in our modern sense of self-expression or aesthetic exploration. They were technical documents that had to be executed according to precise specifications handed down through generations. An artist could not decide to depict the pharaoh in a new, creative way. The pharaoh had to be shown in the traditional forms with the traditional symbols in the traditional poses, or the magic would not work. Despite these constraints, or perhaps because of them, Egyptian artists created some of the most recognizable and powerful images in all of human history. The pharaoh running his ceremonial course, the pharaoh seated on his throne receiving offerings, the pharaoh raising the Djed pillar, the pharaoh being crowned with the double crown. These images have come down to us across more than 3,000 years, as fresh and vital as the day they were carved. The artists achieved something remarkable. They created works that were simultaneously completely traditional and completely alive, that followed ancient patterns while still conveying energy and meaning and power. Foreign dignitaries sometimes witnessed Sed festivals, especially during periods when Egypt had extensive diplomatic and trade relationships with other nations. Envoys from Nubia to the south, from the Levant to the northeast, from Mesopotamia far to the east, from the Aegean islands across the sea, might be present at a great pharaoh's jubilee. For these foreign visitors, the Sed Festival would have been overwhelming, a demonstration of Egypt's wealth, power, sophistication, and divine favor. The message to foreign observers was clear and unmistakable. Egypt is strong. Egypt is eternal. Egypt's king has the blessing of the gods, and you should maintain good relations with such a powerful nation. These foreign witnesses would return to their home countries with stories of the magnificent ceremonies they had witnessed. Egyptian prestige was enhanced throughout the ancient world by reports of Sed festivals, contributing to Egypt's soft power and influence. Other nations wanted to trade with Egypt, to ally with Egypt, to emulate Egyptian culture, partly because of the impressive displays of power and permanence that events like the Sed Festival represented. Egypt's reputation as an ancient, powerful, sophisticated civilization helped it maintain advantageous relationships with neighbors who might otherwise have been enemies. One group of witnesses deserves special mention: the divine witnesses, the gods themselves. Throughout the festival, cult statues of major deities would be present, positioned so that they could see the ceremonies. These statues, which were normally kept in the innermost sanctuaries of temples and rarely seen even by priests, would be brought out for the Sed Festival and placed in specially constructed shrines or on special platforms in the festival court. The gods were not just being informed about the festival, they were being asked to witness and approve the pharaoh's renewal. This idea that gods could see through their statues was central to Egyptian religion. The statues were not merely representations or symbols of gods. They were, in a very real sense, the gods themselves, or at least vessels that the gods inhabited. The divine Ka would enter the statue during appropriate rituals, making it alive and aware. When prayers were directed to a statue, the god within it heard them. When offerings were placed before a statue, the god accepted them. And when a statue was positioned to observe a ceremony like the Sed Festival, the god witnessed everything that happened, evaluating whether the rituals were performed correctly, whether the pharaoh was worthy, whether the cosmic order was being properly maintained. The positioning of divine statues during the Sed Festival created a sacred geometry, a spatial arrangement that had symbolic and magical significance. The pharaoh would be at the center of the festival court, with statues of gods arranged around him in a pattern that reflected Egyptian cosmology. The sun gods might be positioned to the east, the direction of sunrise and rebirth. Gods of the dead like Osiris and Anubis would be to the west, the direction of sunset and the entrance to the underworld. Gods associated with Upper Egypt would be to the south. Gods associated with Lower Egypt would be to the north. This arrangement turned the festival court into a map of the Egyptian universe, with the pharaoh at the exact center, the axis around which everything revolved. At the conclusion of a Sed Festival, there would typically be some kind of final ceremony where the pharaoh would address the assembled witnesses, both human and divine. He might give a speech, though unfortunately we do not have any complete texts of such speeches preserved. Based on other royal speeches that have survived, we can imagine that he would likely thank the gods for their blessings, thank the priests for their faithful service, thank the officials for their loyalty and competence, and promise to continue ruling justly, maintaining Ma'at, protecting Egypt, and honouring the gods for many more years to come. The witnesses would then depart, carrying with them the memory of what they had seen, sharing stories of the festival throughout Egypt and beyond. These stories would help maintain the pharaoh's prestige and authority. They would reinforce the idea that he was the legitimate ruler, chosen by the gods, renewed in his strength, and capable of ruling for many more years. The witnesses thus became messengers, spreading the word about the successful completion of the Sed Festival and all that it represented. As you rest here now, imagine being one of those witnesses. You have stood in the festival court for days, observing ritual after ritual. You have seen the pharaoh run his course, proving his vitality. You have watched as the Djed pillar was raised, symbolizing resurrection and renewal. You have witnessed offerings beyond counting, mountains of food and drink presented to the gods. You have heard prayers and hymns that connected you to 3,000 years of tradition. You have smelled the incense that sanctified every action. You have felt the presence of the gods, vast and ancient and powerful, watching from their statues with eyes that seemed almost alive. Your feet are tired from standing on stone floors for so many hours. Your eyes are weary from the brilliant colours of the decorations, the bright Egyptian sun, the flickering lamps in temple sanctuaries. Your mind is full of images and sounds and sensations that you will never forget, that you will tell your children and grandchildren about for the rest of your life. But your heart is full of something else. Satisfaction, relief, confidence, hope. You have witnessed something extraordinary, something that connects the present moment to the most ancient past and to the eternal future. You have seen a God-King renew his power. You have been present at a moment when the cosmic order was adjusted and strengthened. And now, as you prepare to return to your home, to your ordinary life, far from the centres of power, you carry with you the knowledge that for at least a few more years, Egypt is safe. The pharaoh is strong. The gods are satisfied. Ma'at prevails. The Nile will flood at its appointed time. The grain will grow. The sun will rise each morning. The dead will be properly resurrected in the afterlife. All is as it should be, as it has been, as it will continue to be for millions of years. And you were there. You witnessed it. You are part of this eternal story. Chapter 8. The legacy that transcends time. The last Sed Festival celebrated in ancient Egypt took place over 2,000 years ago. Yet the legacy of these ceremonies continues to resonate through history, archaeology, art, and our understanding of what it means to be human. The Sed Festival was more than a historical event or a religious ceremony. It was a profound statement about power, mortality, and the human drive to create meaning and continuity in the face of inevitable decline and death. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Sed Festival tradition is its incredible longevity. From the first dynasty, around 3,000 years before the Common Era, through the Ptolemaic period, which ended with the death of Cleopatra in 30 years before the Common Era, pharaohs celebrated Sed festivals for nearly 3,000 years. Think about that time span. 3,000 years is longer than the entire history of Christianity. It is longer than most nations and civilizations have existed. It is difficult for us to comprehend that kind of continuity, that depth of tradition. During those 3 millennia, Egypt changed dramatically. Languages evolved, religious beliefs shifted, foreign peoples invaded and ruled. The very landscape was transformed as the Nile changed its course, as cities rose and fell, as the desert encroached on formerly fertile areas. Yet through all these changes, the Sed Festival endured, maintaining its essential form and meaning from the earliest dynasties through the final pharaohs. This longevity tells us something important about the festival and about the civilization that created it. The Sed Festival worked. It served a real function in Egyptian society, helping to legitimize rulers, creating moments of national unity, renewing the connection between the human and divine realms, and providing a framework for understanding aging, power, and renewal. It was not an empty tradition maintained through inertia. It was a living practice that continued because it fulfilled genuine needs. Modern scholars have learned an enormous amount about ancient Egypt through studying Sed Festival remains. The architectural complexes like Djos's step pyramid, the temple reliefs depicting festival scenes, the artifact objects used in ceremonies, the texts describing rituals, all of these provide windows into Egyptian beliefs, values, and practices. When archaeologists excavate a Sed Festival court, they are not just uncovering old stones, they are accessing a time machine that allows us to understand how people thought and lived thousands of years ago. One of the most interesting modern debates about the Sed Festival concerns whether it evolved over time or remained essentially unchanged. Some scholars argue that the festival was constantly being reinterpreted and adapted to new circumstances, with each pharaoh adding their own innovations while claiming to follow ancient tradition. Others contend that Egyptian conservatism and reverence for the past meant that the festival remained remarkably consistent over millennia, with only minor variations. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. The core of the festival, the ceremonial run, the multiple crownings, the raising of the Djed seems to have remained stable. But the details, the emphasis, the interpretation likely varied depending on the individual pharaoh, the political circumstances, and the religious climate of each particular era. The Sed Festival also raises interesting questions about the nature of tradition and authenticity. By the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years had passed since Djoser built his step pyramid complex. The priests and pharaohs of the New Kingdom were looking back at Old Kingdom practices across a gulf of time as large as the one that separates us from the Middle Ages. How accurate was their understanding of ancient rituals? Were they faithfully reproducing Old Kingdom ceremonies? Or were they creating something new while claiming ancient authority? Did it matter, as long as the rituals worked on a symbolic and magical level? These questions are not just academic curiosities. They touch on fundamental issues about how traditions are maintained and transmitted, about the relationship between past and present, about how we construct and understand authenticity. The ancient Egyptians would probably say that exact historical accuracy was less important than magical effectiveness. As long as the Sed Festival rituals successfully renewed the pharaoh's power and maintained Ma'at, the gods did not care whether every detail perfectly matched what had been done 1,000 years earlier. For modern people, the Sed Festival offers lessons that transcend its specific historical and cultural context. The festival was fundamentally about dealing with aging and mortality, about finding ways to renew strength and purpose in the face of inevitable decline. These are universal human concerns. We all grow older. We all face diminishing capabilities. We all wonder whether we still have value and purpose as we age. The Sed Festival provided the ancient Egyptians with a framework for addressing these concerns. transforming the challenge of aging into an opportunity for renewal and transformation. The idea that a leader should periodically be tested and renewed is also worth considering. In modern democracies, we have elections that serve a somewhat similar function, regularly evaluating whether leaders still have the support and confidence of the people. The Sed Festival was not democratic in any sense, but it did create a moment when the pharaoh had to prove his fitness, when his right to continue ruling was publicly tested. There was something healthy about this acknowledgement that even absolute monarchs had to periodically demonstrate their worthiness, rather than simply assuming they could rule forever without question. The architectural legacy of the Sed Festival continues to inspire awe and wonder. When tourists visit Egypt today and walk through Djed's step pyramid complex, they are walking through spaces designed for Sed Festival ceremonies. When they look at temple reliefs showing pharaohs in festival regalia, they are seeing images that were created to allow those kings to celebrate eternal jubilees in the afterlife. These ancient structures and images have survived war, natural disasters, climate change, and the simple erosion of time to speak to us across millennia. Modern Egypt takes pride in this ancient heritage. The Sed Festival and other ancient Egyptian traditions form part of the national identity of contemporary Egyptians. Even though modern Egyptian culture is primarily Arabic and Islamic, rather than ancient pharaonic, there is something powerful about living in a land with such an extraordinary history, about being able to point to monuments created by your ancestors thousands of years ago and saying, "They built this, they achieved this. This is part of my heritage." The academic study of the Sed Festival continues to evolve as new discoveries are made and new analytical techniques are applied to old evidence. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, chemical analysis of artifacts, computer modeling of ancient sites, all of these modern technologies are providing new insights into how Sed festivals were organized and celebrated. Egyptology is a dynamic field where new information constantly forces scholars to re-evaluate old assumptions and develop new theories. One recent area of interest is the economic impact of Sed festivals. Some scholars are now studying these celebrations as major economic events that required mobilizing enormous resources, provided employment for thousands of workers, and stimulated trade networks across Egypt and beyond. From this perspective, the Sed Festival was not just a religious ceremony but also a form of economic stimulus that helped maintain prosperity and social cohesion. The pharaoh who celebrated a Sed Festival was not just renewing his divine power, he was also pumping wealth through the Egyptian economy, much like modern governments might use major projects or events to stimulate economic activity. Another emerging area of study concerns the psychology of Sed Festival participants. What did it feel like to be a priest performing these ancient rituals? What emotions did the pharaoh experience as he ran the ceremonial course, knowing that his fitness and legitimacy were being publicly tested? How did ordinary Egyptians respond to announcements of a royal jubilee? Modern scholars are applying insights from psychology, neuroscience, and anthropology to understand the human experience behind the historical records. The influence of ancient Egyptian practices like the Sed Festival can be traced through later cultures. The Greeks and Romans, who eventually ruled Egypt, were fascinated by pharaonic traditions. Some Roman emperors adopted Egyptian royal imagery and may have incorporated elements of Sed Festival symbolism into their own legitimation strategies. Early Christian monks living in the Egyptian desert were surrounded by ancient temples and may have been influenced by pharaonic religious concepts, even as they developed their own spiritual practices. In modern popular culture, ancient Egypt continues to fascinate. Movies, novels, video games, and documentaries regularly feature pharaohs, pyramids, and ancient rituals. While these popular representations are often historically inaccurate, they demonstrate the enduring power of Egyptian imagery and concepts. There is something about ancient Egypt that captures the imagination, perhaps because it represents such an incredible achievement. a civilization that created extraordinary monuments and sophisticated culture thousands of years before our modern world. For those interested in history, archaeology, or religion, studying the Sed Festival provides insights into how complex civilizations function. The festival was simultaneously a religious ritual, a political ceremony, an economic event, a work of performance art, and a statement about the nature of reality. It brought together every aspect of Egyptian culture into a unified whole. Understanding the Sed Festival means understanding ancient Egypt at a fundamental level. As we come to the end of our journey through the Sed Festival, take a moment to reflect on what we have explored together. We have walked through stone courts built 4,500 years ago. We have witnessed pharaohs running ceremonial courses to prove their vitality. We have seen crowning ceremonies that connected kings to divine powers. We have watched as Djed pillars were raised, symbolizing resurrection and renewal. We have observed offerings being made to satisfy gods and maintain cosmic order. We have stood among witnesses, both human and divine, who came together to observe and validate the renewal of royal power. The Sed Festival was many things, but at its core, it was about continuity in the face of change, about renewal in the face of aging, about life in the face of death, about order in the face of chaos. These are eternal human concerns. The ancient Egyptians created the Sed Festival as their answer to these challenges, and for 3,000 years it worked, helping to maintain one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, carry with you images from this ancient ceremony. Picture the pharaoh in his white linen kilt, running his course as the gods watch. Picture the Djed pillar rising toward the sky, promising resurrection and eternal life. Picture the temples filled with offerings and incense smoke. Picture the priests chanting prayers that had been spoken for thousands of years. Picture the Nile flowing as it has always flowed, the sun rising as it has always risen, the eternal cycles continuing as they always have and always will. The Sed Festival promised that what was renewed would endure, that what stood would not fall, that what was true would remain true forever. And in a sense, that promise has been kept. The pharaohs who celebrated these festivals are gone, but their monuments remain. The specific rituals are no longer performed, but the ideas behind them continue to resonate. The ancient Egyptian civilization has ended, but its legacy endures, teaching us about human achievement, human aspiration, and the eternal human drive to create meaning and purpose in our brief lives. As you let yourself relax completely now, let go of the need to remember every detail. Let the images and ideas wash over you like the Nile flood, nourishing but not overwhelming. Let yourself drift on the current of history, surrounded by the prayers of ancient priests, the music of ancient instruments, the presence of ancient gods who still linger in the stones of Egypt. Let yourself become part of the eternal story, the story of renewal and continuity, the story that the Sed Festival told for 3,000 years and that we are still telling tonight, across gulfs of time that seem vast but are, in the grand sweep of cosmic time, merely moments. The sun sets over Egypt as it has set for millions of years. The stars appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that ancient pharaohs watched, the same patterns that guided them, the same eternal points of light that promised order and stability in an uncertain world. The Nile flows northward to the sea, carrying the water that gives life, just as it has always flowed. And somewhere in the desert night, among the ruins of temples and palaces, the spirits of ancient kings continue their eternal Sed festivals, running their courses, receiving their crowns, raising their Djed pillars, maintaining Ma'at, ensuring that the cosmic order continues, that life triumphs over death, that renewal follows aging, that the cycle never ends. Rest now. Let the weight of 3,000 years of wisdom and tradition support you. Let the ancient rituals work their magic on your modern mind. Let yourself be renewed, just as the pharaohs were renewed, ready to wake tomorrow with fresh strength and purpose. The Sed Festival's quiet grandeur surrounds you, embraces you, carries you gently into sleep and dreams, where perhaps you too will run between boundary stones, will receive divine crowns, will touch Djed pillars and feel their power flowing into you, will become part of the eternal story that began so long ago and continues still, will never end, continues forever, as long as the Nile flows, as long as the sun rises, as long as someone remembers and tells the story of Egypt's eternal kings and their sacred festivals of renewal. Sleep now. The festivals are complete. The gods are satisfied. Ma'at prevails. All is well. All has always been well. All will always be well. Sleep.